This was the life of a commercial fisherman in the USA. In the Bering Sea king crab fishery in 1970, the occupational fatality rate reached 770 deaths per 100,000 workers per year. 770. That is not a typo. It is not a misprint. To understand what that number means, consider this. Coal mining, the industry that Americans in 1970 widely considered the most dangerous job in the country, ran at roughly 60 deaths per 100,000. The Bering Sea crab fleet was killing its workers at a rate more than 12 times higher than the coal mines of West Virginia. And yet every winter, when the king crab season opened, the boats went out. Across the broader commercial fishing industry in the United States in 1970, an average of 38 to 40 fishermen died every single year in Alaskan waters alone, not counting the deaths in New England, the Gulf of Mexico, or the Pacific coast. Most of those men drowned. Most of them were not wearing life jackets when they went into the water, because in 1970 there was no federal law requiring them to. There were no mandatory survival suits, no mandatory life rafts, no mandatory emergency beacons, no required safety training for any crew member on any commercial fishing vessel operating anywhere in American waters. The sea killed these men, and the government had not yet decided it was obligated to do anything about it. What was it like to be one of those men? What did they know about their own odds, and what made them go out anyway? And before we continue, comment below if you have ever worked in a dangerous job. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming content. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. The commercial fishing fleet of the United States in 1970 was not a single industry operating under a single set of conditions. It was several entirely distinct industries, each working different water, different species, different vessels, different seasons, but sharing a fundamental common reality of physical danger, financial uncertainty, and the particular kind of chronic exhaustion that builds when a man cannot consistently sleep for more than 3 hours at a stretch for weeks at a time. Off the coast of New England, the groundfish fleet worked the shallow, productive plateau called George Bank, which lay roughly 100 miles southeast of Cape Cod. Boats out of Gloucester, New Bedford, and Boston went after Atlantic cod, haddock, yellowtail flounder, pollock, and sea scallops. A typical stern trawler in the New England groundfish fleet of 1970 was between 60 and 120 feet long, carried a crew of 4 to 7 men, and stayed out for anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks per trip. In the Gulf of Mexico, smaller crew boats worked inshore and offshore for brown, pink, and white shrimp, as well as red snapper and grouper. And off the coast of Alaska, expanding rapidly through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, were the most dangerous fisheries in the country. King crab in the Bering Sea, Pacific halibut along the Aleutian chain, and sockeye and king salmon in the waters off Kodiak Island and in Bristol Bay. Each fishery had its own operational calendar, its own crew culture, and its own specific mechanisms for killing the men who worked it. George Bank had been one of the most productive fishing grounds on Earth for centuries. The great schools of Atlantic cod that had drawn European fishing vessels to North American waters since the 1500s were, by 1970, under simultaneous pressure from 2 directions that threatened to overwhelm the bank's capacity to recover. From outside American jurisdiction, massive factory ships from the Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Spain, Portugal, and Japan had arrived on the bank in the 1960s in numbers that American fishermen had never witnessed. In 1965 alone, the Soviet distant water fleet caught 872,000 tons of fish from North American waters. Spain, France, and Portugal caught an additional 600,000 tons. By the early 1970s, the combined European and Soviet fleets were removing an estimated 2 million tons of fish per year from American and Canadian waters combined. These were not fishing boats in any traditional sense. They were floating processing factories, many of them several hundred feet long, capable of catching, processing, and freezing 200 tons of fish per hour, operating continuously around the clock for months without returning to port. A fisherman from Gloucester, who had watched his father and grandfather work the same grounds his entire life, was now going further offshore for smaller catches, staying out longer for diminishing returns, and coming back to a market where prices were being suppressed by the sheer volume of product being stripped from the bank by fleets that operated completely outside any American regulatory framework. The work on deck of a commercial trawler in 1970 was unrelenting and physically punishing in ways that are difficult to fully convey to anyone who has not experienced them. After the net was set over the stern and the boat was towing, a process that typically lasted 4 hours, covering miles of seafloor at a depth of up to 400 feet, the crew worked through whatever repairs, maintenance, and preparation the operation required. When the haulback signal came, all hands went to the deck regardless of the hour or the weather. The net came in over the stern roller through a system of cables and blocks. The cod end, the closed bag at the tail of the net where the catch collected, swinging over the deck and releasing its contents in a surge of cold seawater, fish, and whatever else the net had scraped from the bottom during the tow. The crew sorted the catch fast and with practiced efficiency. Keepers to the hold below packed in ice, unsellable species and undersized fish back over the rail. A large haul on a cold, rolling deck at 2 in the morning, with seas running at 6 feet, and the deck constantly wet and slick, demanded every man on his feet and working at full intensity, regardless of how many consecutive hours had already passed without meaningful sleep. Falls overboard were most common during exactly these periods of peak physical demand, when a man's footing was least secure, and his reaction time most impaired by accumulated fatigue. A man who went over the rail of a commercial fishing vessel on George Bank in winter had a survival window that was not measured in hours. It was measured in minutes, and sometimes in less than that. The water temperature in the North Atlantic off Massachusetts runs between 34 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit from December through March. At those temperatures, the physiological response called cold shock, the involuntary, uncontrollable, gasping reflex triggered by sudden, full-body immersion in cold water, can cause a man to inhale seawater before he has time to understand what has happened to him. If he survives the initial shock without aspirating water, the clock continues to run against him. Meaningful muscle function begins to fail in water at those temperatures within 10 minutes of immersion. Swimming becomes mechanically impossible as the large muscle groups lose coordination. A man in 36 degrees seawater without a survival suit loses functional use of his arms and legs in roughly 10 to 15 minutes and loses consciousness within 30. In 1970, there were no survival suits required on commercial fishing vessels operating in American waters. Most boats did not carry them at all. Personal flotation devices, life jackets, were available on most vessels, but were almost never worn during active deck operations. The fisherman's reasoning was not irrational. A life jacket that snagged on a winch line, a net, or a hydraulic cable could pull a man under faster than it could keep him afloat. So they worked the deck without flotation gear, and when they went over the rail, they drowned. Not because they were careless or poorly trained, but because the North Atlantic at 36 degrees did not allow enough time for rescue to reach them. The Bering Sea represented an entirely separate category of danger. King crab fishing in the Bering Sea in 1970 was conducted in winter, the only season when the crab were legally harvestable and could be found in concentrations large enough to justify the operation, in conditions that made the North Atlantic look manageable. Air temperatures in the Bering Sea in January regularly fell to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit before accounting for the wind chill. Seas regularly ran to 30 and 40 feet, with breaking crests that swept the deck of a working crab boat with thousands of gallons of water in a single wave. Spray froze on every exposed surface continuously, and ice accumulation on a vessel's superstructure, masts, cables, crab pot stacks, the wheelhouse roof, raised its center of gravity progressively with every hour of icing, making the boat increasingly prone to rolling past its recovery angle and capsizing. Crews chipped ice continuously during heavy weather, using sledgehammers and baseball bats in their bare hands if necessary, because the alternative was watching the boat become dangerously top-heavy. The king crab pots themselves were steel-framed boxes 7 feet square, baited with herring or cod, and they weighed 700 pounds empty. Setting them over the side, stacking them on deck, and hauling them back aboard full of crab-involved cranes, hydraulic block systems, and physical labor of a sustained intensity that had no close equivalent in any other American occupation. And the fatality rate in the Bering Sea king crab fishery during this era has been calculated at 770 deaths per 100,000 full-time equivalent workers, the highest occupational death rate ever documented for any peacetime American industry. In the 1970s, an average of 38 to 40 commercial fishermen died every year in Alaskan waters alone. The commercial fishing community was organized around social structures and economic relationships that outsiders rarely understood. In New England, most of the groundfish fleet in 1970 was built from ethnic communities with deep roots in the trade. Portuguese families in New Bedford and Gloucester, whose ancestors had fished from the Azores before immigrating to Massachusetts. Italian families who had worked the same grounds for 3 generations. Scandinavian families who had carried their fishing traditions from Norway and Sweden. In Alaska, the crews were drawn from a wider geographic range. Men from Washington, Oregon, and California who had followed the money north, along with Alaska native fishermen whose families had worked those waters for centuries before the commercial industry arrived. The pay system that governed most fisheries was the share system, in which each crew member received a negotiated percentage of the vessel's net proceeds after fuel, food, ice, and gear costs were deducted from the gross value of the catch. On a good trip to a productive ground, a deckhand could earn more in 2 weeks than a factory worker earned in 2 months. On a bad trip, 2 weeks at sea, marginal catches, a market price that had dropped while the boat was offshore, engine trouble that ate into the net proceeds, a man could come home with almost nothing after 2 weeks of work. The skipper, who typically owned the vessel or was making loan payments on it, carried the heaviest financial exposure of anyone. A boat that wasn't fishing was generating debt, not income. The pressure to go out in weather that prudence might counsel against, to push the grounds further offshore than the vessel's design was intended for, to remain at sea beyond the point at which the crew could safely operate. That pressure was structural and constant, and it contributed to deaths as reliably as any mechanical failure or freak wave. The families of commercial fishermen in New England in 1970 lived on a schedule that had no equivalent in the lives of their neighbors who worked ashore. In the fishing towns of Gloucester and New Bedford, time was measured not in weeks, but in trips, by how many days since the boat had left the dock, by whether the weather reports had been bad enough to warrant real concern, by the particular silence of a house where the man who usually filled it was somewhere out on the North Atlantic. There was no way to reach a boat at sea by telephone in 1970. Commercial fishing vessels in the groundfish fleet of that era were not equipped with the satellite communication systems that would arrive decades later. If something happened to a vessel at sea, notification came through the Coast Guard or through another boat that had witnessed the incident or found wreckage. In the fishing neighborhoods of Gloucester and New Bedford, every woman who was married to a fisherman knew what it meant when an unfamiliar car pulled up in front of the house during a trip. She had seen it happen to a neighbor. She had seen the face of the woman who answered the door. Some fishing families had lost men across multiple generations, a father, an uncle, a brother, and the knowledge of that accumulated loss shaped how they understood the work without any single conversation ever needing to make it explicit. The regulatory environment surrounding commercial fishing in 1970 was almost entirely absent. The Occupational Safety and Health Act was signed into law by President Nixon in December of 1970, but its early years of implementation focused primarily on fixed industrial workplaces on land, where inspectors could access job sites and where working conditions could be standardized and observed. Commercial fishing vessels, small, privately owned, operating far offshore in conditions that no land-based inspector ever witnessed, remained almost entirely outside practical regulatory reach. The United States Coast Guard had jurisdiction over vessel safety in general maritime terms, but its safety standards for commercial fishing boats in this period were not substantially more demanding than those applied to recreational vessels of comparable size. There were no federal requirements mandating survival suits on commercial fishing vessels. No mandatory emergency position indicating radio beacons, no required life raft specifications for boats under a certain length, no mandatory crew training in emergency procedures, no certification requirement for skippers of commercial fishing vessels. Men learned the work by going out. They learned from the experienced men on the boats they crewed. They learned from the close calls that didn't kill them, and they carried that knowledge forward as long as they were alive to use it. The pay that commercial fishing offered in 1970 was one of the few things that made the conditions comprehensible to anyone looking at them from the outside. A skilled deckhand on a productive New England groundfish boat could clear $2,000 to $3,000 on a good 2-week trip in 1970. Wages that compared favorably with almost any blue-collar occupation available to a man without a college education. In the Alaska king crab fishery, where the danger was greatest, the pay was correspondingly higher, and the combination of risk and reward attracted men from across the country who were willing to trade safety for income. Young men from inland states who had never seen the ocean before arrived in Kodiak and Dutch Harbor looking for work on crab boats, sometimes with no maritime experience at all. Skippers who were short a crew member before the season opened occasionally hired whoever was standing on the dock. The Darby-style management of the crab fishery, in which the entire annual quota could be harvested in a matter of days, meaning every boat raced to catch as much as possible before the quota closed, created incentives to overload vessels with crab pots, to run in weather that should have kept them in harbor, and to push crews past any reasonable limit of safe fatigue. It was a system that prioritized volume over survival, and the death toll reflected that priority with statistical regularity every winter in the Bering Sea. The death toll in American commercial fishing began a sustained decline after the Commercial Fishing Industry Vessel Safety Act of 1988 mandated survival suits, emergency position indicating radio beacons, inflatable life rafts, and regular onboard safety drills for vessels operating in the most hazardous fisheries. The change in Alaska was the most measurable. In the 1970s, when 38 to 40 fishermen died per year in Alaskan waters, the total represented a rate of mortality that had been accepted as essentially inevitable by the industry, by the government, and by most of the public, which paid little attention to deaths that happened so far from shore. By the early years of the 21st century, that annual death toll had fallen to an average of 3.5 per year. The same species were being caught, the same waters, the same weather. What had changed was the equipment required on the vessel and the training required of the people aboard it. That gap between the death toll of the 1970s and the death toll 20 and 30 years later represents not a statistical abstraction, but individual men who came home to their families because regulations existed that had not existed before. The fishermen who died in the years before those regulations were written did not die because commercial fishing was inherently unsurvivable or because their deaths were acceptable. They died in a period when the United States government had not yet fully decided that the people who harvested the nation's seafood, who worked some of the most physically demanding and genuinely dangerous conditions in the American economy, deserved the same legal protections as workers in any other industry. That decision, when it finally came, was built on the weight of every name in every Coast Guard incident report. Men who went out in the dark and did not come back, and whose deaths, taken together, finally demanded an answer.